I'm Jen Geisinger, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about dual agency. Dual agency is important to understand when you're agreeing to work with a realtor to either buy or sell a house. The contract will ask you, do you agree to dual agency or don't you? And whenever I ask buyers and sellers this, they look at me with a confused, glazed over look in their eye and say, I guess. So I proceed to explain to them what dual agency is and why it's important to understand whether or not it's something that you want to do. In a traditional real estate transaction, you've got a listing agent who's working with the seller to put their home on the market. Then you've got a buyer who would like to buy that home. In a perfect world, they'd like to buy that home, and they've got an agent. If the buyer's agent and the seller's agent are with different brokerages, for instance, I'm with Luke Team Real Estate. If the buyer's agent is with any other brokerage, it is not dual agency, no concerns. However, let's say another agent with Luke Team Real Estate decides to bring a buyer through the listing I have and write up a contract representing the buyer. Because I'm with Luke Team Real Estate and the buyer's agent is with Luke Team Real Estate, it's considered dual agency. Now, dual agency became a bit of a concern back in the day when realtor offices, brokerages were brick and mortar. There were big offices with lunchrooms and water coolers and coffee pots, and people would congregate and visit and talk about different things. And let's say I'm in the lunchroom and I'm saying to maybe my admin assistant, you know, the Joneses really have to sell by Friday or their house is going to start going into foreclosure proceedings. So I certainly hope we get an offer by Friday. Well, let's say there's an agent around the corner listening, not out of malice, but you know how it is. And he just so happens to have a buyer that would probably work out great based on the location and the price range for the listing I have. Well, now that buyer's agent has information about my listing and my seller's motivation for selling, that isn't really something that should be divulged, okay? So it was sort of based on water cooler talk and agents in the same offices, there was a fear of collusion and them working together just to get the best deal for their buyers or to get their sellers' home sold quickly. So that's when dual agency started becoming something that the Department of Commerce wanted to make sure was disclosed. Now, another form of dual agency is if not only are the two agents with the same brokerage, but what if I'm the agent for both the seller and the buyer? Here's the situation. Let's say I have a house listed in Maple Grove, and there's a sign out front, a for sale sign, and it's got great brochures and a virtual tour, and people love it and want to see it, and they call me because my phone number's on the sign, and they say, hey, Jen Geisinger, I see you've got a listing there in Maple Grove. I love it. I'd like to look at it. First thing I'm going to ask them is, do you have an agent already? And if they say no, we would like you to represent us. That's considered the scariest form of dual agency, if you will. Because not only does the seller employ me to sell their home, but now the buyer wants to employ me to help them buy the home. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that seems like a huge conflict of interest. How can you represent both the seller and the buyer in the same transaction? Here's how it's done. When I am representing a seller in a transaction, there are certain things I can tell a buyer, things I cannot tell a buyer, and things I have to tell a buyer. For instance, if the seller says to me, hey Jen, every spring our roof caves in when the snow melts, but we tape it up and we repaint it and everything looks perfect right now. So nobody's going to notice it until next spring when they're already in here and the roof caves in and we'll be long gone by then. that's a disclosure item that I have to tell the buyer, okay? And not just a buyer, if I represent a buyer, any buyer that comes through the house needs to know that. So that's an example of things I have to tell a buyer. Things I cannot tell the buyer are, why is the seller moving? What is their motivation? What is their bottom line? What is their perfect close date based on some, extenuating circumstance? I can only tell a buyer things that are just in writing. A seller has to tell me. I can tell a buyer when it comes to motivation, terms, things like that. Okay, so I just lost my train of thought. So a buyer might say to me, well, you're working with these sellers, they hired you, how much will they really take for the house? I mean, we're going to offer less, do you think they'll take that or not? I can't give them that information, just like I couldn't give any buyer that information that is coming to me as a buyer of any agent in the Twin Cities. I can't divulge that information, okay? Likewise, if a buyer comes to me and says, we want you to represent us, here's our pre-approval letter. It was really valid last week because, we were making good money, but yesterday we got laid off. Don't tell the seller that, because here's a pre-approval letter. It's just from a week ago. I have to tell the seller that. I have to tell the seller that there's a situation that is concerning regarding their pre-approval with their lender. So the bottom line is, I can't work to the benefit of one party if it's going to be detrimental to the other party. And again, the important thing to remember is, dual agency or not, when there's a buyer coming to a listing of mine, there's things I can tell the buyer, can't tell the buyer, have to tell the buyer. And there's things I can tell the seller about the buyer, things I cannot tell the seller, and things I have to tell the seller about the buyer. So those are the biggest, that, like I said, the most typical, easiest, most straightforward transaction would be if I, with Luke Team Real Estate, have a listing, and then the buyer comes from a brokerage with any brokerage other than Luke Team Real Estate. Then you've got dual agency with two different agents, a listing agent and a buyer's agent that are with the same brokerage. And then there is dual agency, which is me representing sellers and me representing buyers. I have got fiduciary responsibilities owed to anybody that signs a contract with me, whether it's a buyer or a seller. I have to be loyal to them. I have to be obedient to them within the parameters of the law. I have to keep things confidential. I cannot disclose anything that is confidential for either party. I have to be true and honest with disclosure. Like I mentioned before, I have to disclose things even if the seller or buyer tells me not to. And I have to take reasonable care when performing duties as an agent. And I have to be also responsible with accounting if there's earnest money involved or anything of value that's changing hands. So once you've signed a contract with any agent, they owe you those fiduciary responsibilities, and those do not terminate until the closing of a property or the expiration of a contract, with the exception of confidentiality. Once confidential, always confidential until the end of time. Hopefully that clears up dual agency a little bit more for you. Again, in the state of Minnesota, you can say, hey, I don't really want to do dual agency. I think it's weird. I don't really feel comfortable with it. Or you can say, I'm fine with dual agency, whatever works. The reason some people might not want to count out dual agency is that there's some brokers in the Twin Cities that have hundreds of agents. If you tell your buyer's agent, hey, I don't want to do dual agency, don't show me any listings that are listed with your brokerage. That might eliminate several hundred properties for you to look at. So that's the downside of not agreeing to dual agency. So just talk to your agent about that. Make sure you understand the pros and cons of it, as far as how much will it change either your buyer pool or your inventory pool, depending on whether you're a buyer or a seller. I hope this clears up dual agency. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. Post a comment below or check in on our Facebook page. LiveMNN is our handle on Facebook, and ask us a question, and we'll get right back to you. Have a great day.